Hello and welcome to Our Voices. Human trafficking is a global crime with millions of victims, most of them females, mainly adult women, but also increasingly girls, according to a new UN global report on human trafficking. But there are new measures being taken to combat the issue. And as we'll hear later in the program, survivors are finding the courage to speak out. Welcome to this complex and important conversation. I'm Ayan Bior, here along with my colleagues Haiti Adams-Fitzpatrick, Ariane Itangishaka, and joining us for the first time is VOA Zimbabwe Service digital lead journalist Marvelous Nyahuye. Welcome, Marvelous.
Thank you for having me. This is a topic that's really close to my heart. I had the privilege of actually doing an expose on human trafficking of Zimbabwean young women and girls to Kuwait and other Middle East countries. So stay tuned. We'll be giving you more.
And we're going to lean a little more on your reporting later on in the program to understand how African migrants get coerced into human trafficking abroad and what some of the survivors are telling you.
Yes.
But first, we start the conversation at home on our continent. In September last year, police rescued 94 people, including children, from a human trafficking network. They came from Chad, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Eritrea, Niger, South Sudan, and Sudan, and were forced to work in illegally operated gold mines in Sudan. 6 months later, another rescue. This time, Interpol broke up a sex trafficking ring in West Africa. Out of 200 victims, 157 were children that came from the Republic of Benin, Burkina Faso, Niger, Nigeria, and Togo, and were forced to perform sex work and other forms of forced labor. The youngest victim was 11 years old. Fighting human trafficking is complex, and perpetrators operate unnoticed, making them difficult to apprehend, according to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. But some African governments are coming up with new strategies and are creating new partnerships to tackle the issue and bring criminals to justice. Burundi launched a 3-year anti-human trafficking plan with the International Organization for Migration. Togo was upgraded to Tier 2 on this year's U.S. State Department's Trafficking Persons report, after the West African nation made sustained efforts to eliminate human trafficking within its borders. 25 other sub-Saharan African countries joined Togo in their Tier 2 designation. Despite the progress in some countries, sub-Saharan Africa has 8 countries on the Tier 3 list. These are countries whose governments do not fully meet the minimum standards and are not making significant efforts to do so. To help us make sense of this is Bandak Lul. Lul is joining us from Phoenix, Arizona, and he is the Research Project Director at Arizona State University's Office of Sex Trafficking Intervention Research. Welcome to the program, Bandak.
Thank you so much, Ian, for having me, and that's a great introduction.
So let's just get right into the conversation. What is human trafficking, and does it always involve the movement of people from one place to another?
So according to the U.S. Federal definition of human trafficking, it's involved 2 severe forms of human trafficking, and that includes sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And sex trafficking is defined as a commercial sexual act in which a person is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which a person is induced by performing sexual acts under the age of 18. So as long as the person is under the age of 18, it's always sex trafficking, because a person cannot consent to sex when they are at the age of 18, when they are minors. While on the other hand, labor trafficking is defined as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. And no, to answer your question, a person does not have to physically be transported from one location to another for the crime to be within this definition. So a person can still be trafficked where they are originally located, and they don't have to be transported to another location.
And what would you say are the major causes, and are there any new measures that are coming in to combat this problem?
So the major causes of human trafficking, there's many vulnerabilities. And here domestically in the United States, we'll find that most of the victims who are victims of human trafficking are those who came from a background of being runaways and homeless youth. as well as poverty. For those who are international victims, there are some language barriers, poverty, cultural factors, geography, for them being in unfamiliar places, and there's also legal status and the lack of resources. I can give you one example. When someone comes from any port of United States, they're not given any documentation regarding labor laws, and when they come here, the language barriers actually permits them from seeking help when they find themselves in such a situation. Currently, if you go to any airport, especially if you go to Las Vegas Airport or Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, you'll see signs of human trafficking prevention. And there are 3 P's that have been put in place by federal laws, and that include prevention, which is awareness, and also addressing root causes of human trafficking. For example, right now, there are signs in the Phoenix Sky Harbor where it says, say something, see something. And this is actually alerting travelers when they are traveling and they see something that is very unusual. There's also another P, which is persecution, include investigations, also cooperating with international law regarding human trafficking. And there's a protection part, which is to protect human trafficking victims and include assistance and compensation for victims of human trafficking.
We see that the continent is really fighting really hard trafficking, whether it be sex trafficking or labor trafficking. We see the continent, the burst in September of 94, and after that 6 months later, 200. But what are the telltale signs that the population itself can actually do to intervene when they see something that's not right, people being trafficked, but they're not sure? What are some telltale signs that people can actually see and identify sex trafficking or labor trafficking?
So some of the indicators of someone who's being trafficked include unpaid or paid person being paid very little. There's frequent movements of claim of just visiting to a particular location, say for those who are migrants. And also, if you ask an individual of his surroundings, they're not aware of their surrounding, his or her surrounding, and they're not able to provide an address of residential addresses of where they're residing, and that's because they move a lot with their traffickers. And one of the reasons for traffickers to move the victim is because they don't want to be identified by law enforcement in that particular place. So they make sure that their victims are moved and they're not being followed. As far as jurisdiction follows when it comes to law enforcement, there's also they also cannot provide any information regarding their documentation. It could be false documentation. There's temporary residence such as local hotels or motels. They work long hours and also inadequate clothing given the weather or time of the day or season. So if you see someone who's actually wearing heavy clothes in a temperature that is 115 degrees, say in Phoenix, Arizona, that is a sign of that might be a sign of someone being labor trafficked or sex trafficked. So in addition to that, they exhibit signs of sleep deprivation, poor hygiene, physical or sexual abuse. So for those who are in the health industry, these are something to look for.
Bandak, we often hear that poverty is a major push factor when it comes to trafficking, but not all poor people end up being trafficked. So which groups are more vulnerable than others?
I can say anyone. Unlike slavery back in the day, slavery now is very different. Of course, it's illegal, and also there's no ownership to any person. So as far as slavery goes today, it's cheaper, and also anyone can traffic anyone. So there's no particular group that is immune to being trafficked. It could be a rich kid who's just run away from their home in a suburban. It could be someone who lives in poverty. It could be a runaway child. It could be an immigrant, a disabled person. Male, females, and transgender person are all vulnerable to human trafficking.
Bandak, thank you so much for joining us today. Bandak Lul is the Research Project Director at the Office of Sex Trafficking Intervention Research at Arizona State University, and he was speaking to us from Arizona, Phoenix.
Thanks for having me again today. I'm very pleased to be speaking about this very important topic.
Well, has someone you know been affected by human trafficking? Has it happened to you? Tell us your story and share your thoughts with us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. Our handle there is @VOA Our Voices. Also use the hashtag VOA Our Voices. You can also text us on WhatsApp. That number is there on your screen.
Some go overseas to find jobs and instead find a life of imprisonment and forced labor. We'll explore that after the break. But first, despite the trauma of human trafficking, many survivors are now speaking up. We'll be right back.
My journey into modern day slavery started on the 13th of February and ended on my return on the 6th of July 2016. I sensed something was out of place by the reception we were given when we arrived to Kuwait. We got a one chance to phone home and the conversation was monitored. It was then I first want my parents to report and on the WhatsApp group for everyone not to come. The working conditions were tough. I had to work for about 20 hours a day. I had to do all the housework, including cooking, laundry, care for the elderly relatives and their pets. I requested for my employer to take me back to the office to go and protest about working conditions, the contract, and to have my passport back. That's when I was put into solitary confinement. My phone was taken. I was deemed a bad influence to other girls. I was locked up day and night on the 10th floor in a smelly, lice-infested, blood-stained cell large enough for a single cot bed for 2 weeks. This was done to break me down. I was then sold to my second employer. At this time, nobody, even my parents, Tinashe, the local agent and the embassy, knew my whereabouts. I witnessed some slave girls beaten unconscious. Others were scalded with hot water, and even hot irons were used to torture. The problems I'm facing now are stigma, low esteem momentarily, post-traumatic stress disorder. I can't go back to the job that I only had. My ex-employer doesn't even entertain me because of the Kuwait experience. The recruiting agency are working free. I even come across them because we live in the same neighborhood. What I'm wearing, what I'm putting on right now is the uniform of humiliation of any girl or woman who falls into the trap of human trafficking in Kuwait. And you have to wear this 24/7. This is the uniform, the Kadama suit.
Voices, we're talking about the news and issues you're talking about.
Sharing stories of development and growth across Africa,
around the world and in our lives.
Topics that inform, empower,
and change the rules.
It's time for Our Voices.
With me, Haiti Adams Fitzpatrick.
And Hadiza Kiari.
And Ayan Bior.
And Orion Itangi Shaka.
Join us on Facebook at VOA Our Voices.
It's time for Our Voices.
Welcome back. Human trafficking is a crime that capitalizes on the vulnerability of its victims. And internally displaced persons, people with no safe place to call home and a desire to provide for their families, could be the targets for this crime.
Human rights activists say countless women and girls who were living in IDP camps in northeast Nigeria have been lured to other countries under false pretenses for sex work or slave labor. A new campaign is trying to educate women about the dangers. In Maiduguri, Chika Odua went out with the campaigners and interviewed 2 women who were trafficked abroad and are now back in Nigeria.
Activists are hitting the streets of Maiduguri to warn people about the dangers of human trafficking. These are people who have come to Maiduguri to run away from the terrorist group Boko Haram. But even in Maiduguri, where they found refuge, other dangers lurk. Human traffickers are seducing IDPs, internally displaced persons, using false promises of employment.
So later on, when they carry them out, then later they will not even give them the job. Then they will starting selling them like slaves. And we have some victims. After we starting this campaign, we got some victims that they have occurred they face these challenges.
Nana Abdullahi, an orphan, was selling goods on Maiduguri streets to make money when she met a man who said he could help her. I told him I would like a job so that I can take care of myself. He said okay, and he took me. I thought we were going someplace like Kano, but when we got there, he went all the way with me to Niger. After a month of what she described as an ordeal, Nana ran away and found her way back to Nigeria. More than 1 million IDPs live in Maiduguri, the capital of northeastern Nigeria's Borno State. This is where Boko Haram started, launching attacks across the region that have so far killed more than 30,000 people. There are about a dozen IDP camps in the city, and the government says they are frequent targets for traffickers.
People are coming there in the evening for recruiting, I can say, taking young girls, going away with them.
Members of Nigeria's anti-trafficking agency distribute pamphlets to warn of the dangers. But some say their choices in Maiduguri are limited. Mariam Haruna was smuggled into Saudi Arabia, where she worked illegally as a domestic helper.
I spent 2 years there working. Unfortunately, one day when I was coming back from work, I got caught and was deported back home.
Despite having to pay back the man who trafficked her, Mariam says she would rather go back to Saudi Arabia because her life there was better than her life here. But these activists hope she goes back legally. They say people who have suffered and survived Boko Haram attacks should not have to fall victim again to human traffickers. Chika Odua in Maiduguri, Nigeria, for VOA News.
You know, watching this story, it's really incredible. And it makes me wonder, do campaigns like this actually work?
I think the effectiveness or the impact of these campaigns, that's probably debatable, depending on who you speak to and where you are. But I do think sometimes it makes the rest of us very passive when we think, oh, there's always going to be some organization out there, some advocacy group who's really keeping this issue at the forefront of the news headlines. I think the responsibility should be on all of us, not just those of us who are in the media, but also every citizen to educate ourselves and to really equip ourselves with information, know when the telltale signs are, as Bandak just spoke to us earlier about, and to really play our part as well. I mean, if we don't do that, we can't always just rely on that someone else is going to do it, because at some point it's going to be your family member.
And it's also up to the journalist to make sure that we highlight these stories. And I know that you have done some reporting on human trafficking. What did you find?
Yes, I did, Ayan. And what really caught my eye was that the story that each girl and woman told was the same. They were lured into labor, human trafficking. They were promised lucrative jobs overseas, the Middle East, Kuwait, for example. But when they got to Kuwait, what they found, they were retailing horror stories of long hours, some of them sexually molested, some of them abused, their travel documents taken. But, it made a difference in that it started with one girl's story. Her family couldn't get in touch with her. They then went to the media, and for that one, I reported that. And from that story, we had lots of other families coming in to say, we haven't heard from our child. And I then started contacting the embassy in Kuwait to only find out that we had opened Pandora's box. Yeah. There were over maybe 500 girls that were missing at that point in time. They didn't know where the embassy is. They didn't know who to contact. So from that story, now they were coming through and telling their story.
Yes, and I think that the social media also helps. We see YouTube videos, WhatsApp videos, and I got a chance to actually report on that as well when I spoke to women in Kuwait, in Oman, in Saudi Arabia, who I actually spoke to live when they were in the houses where they were working, and they say they went willingly, but they were promised, like you said, they were promised these good jobs. And I think that stories do definitely make a difference, and the media definitely plays a key part. I remember reporting on this, and the government of Burundi actually saying, can you please send us the audio of the show that you just did so we can understand the depth of this situation?
Talking about the government.
Yes, we had children who were actually being taken to the next country, Burundi, Rwanda, and they were moving around that region without any documents. But once we covered it, they realized that this is a situation that they must take, seriously, and they actually took some steps, the Burundian government at that time, and they actually prepared documents to ensure that the women, even crossing on the border, the women who have the children on the back, make sure that you have proper documents for that child, because a lot of time they realized that trafficking was being done by women who pretended to have these children next to them as their own children, and they realized that they weren't their children. So I think that the media can play a definite important part.
And did your story have any impact?
Yes, it did. As I said, because there were no communications between the girls that were being trafficked with the embassy, when they did finally get in touch with the embassy, there were lawmakers that had visited Kuwait when I started doing my stories. So they picked up the story and it went viral, and they were not even aware that there was such an issue in Kuwait. And at that time, the Speaker of Parliament, who was visiting with lawmakers from both the opposition and the ruling party, actually put together their hands to say, no, we would like to repatriate our girls back. And I worked with the Africa Union Ambassador for Goodwill on ending early child marriages, Nyahuye who was instrumental in also starting, fundraising for these girls. After the report that I did in 2016, the Zimbabwean government actually launched a Trafficking in Person, TIP, National Plan of Action, to actually put into effect. They had a Trafficking in Persons Act in 2014, but it wasn't being implemented. So now they had programs to actually repatriate some of these girls back to Zimbabwe.
And sometimes it's just the embassies in those countries that can actually make a big difference.
Part of the reason why I think human trafficking is so hard to combat is that it's a pretty lucrative business. 150 billion US dollars per year brings in illegal profits, according to the International Labor Organization.
Yes. Well, speaking of the power of news and also the power of money, two people who've been in the news recently, American multimillionaire financier Jeffrey Epstein and of course singer R. Kelly, both now facing sex trafficking charges. This is really, I think, going to be a litmus test for justice. Because people are going to be watching whether they are actually going to be brought to book or whether they're going to get off.
That's right.
And I tell you what's going to be really pivotal here is if the American criminal justice system fails or really shows up for the victims. Because you can just imagine, if it fails the victims here, imagine what's happening in countries with broken criminal justice systems and what people can get away with here. And what's so tragic is we've seen the history of these men. One, a registered sex offender. R. Kelly has had allegations of sex crimes, swirling about him for years now. And here we are again, not sure if these guys are actually going to get off again. Because, money, connections, power, celebrity.
Yeah, and I think that we also have to point out the fact that there are warning signs that countries give to people in the country not to go to certain places, certain countries, but people just override those warnings. They just end up going on their own and end up being trafficked. So I think that when governments and countries ring the bells and tell people, look, you cannot go into a country without proper document, or they need to really listen to these warning signs.
And from what I saw doing the stories, they actually insisted that when you do go into a country, whether you're going there for labor or for whatever reason, always know where your embassy is, because if you're trafficked,
important.
That's your first point of call. And as we speak right now, Zimbabwe was able to repatriate 120 girls as a result of that report.
And this is so important to not just have survivors speak up, but the rest of us, like we said earlier, everybody play a role. And after the break, we're going to introduce you to African women at the forefront of the fight to end human trafficking. Our Women to Watch segment is next. Back in a moment.
Welcome back. Every day, women across the continent and in the diaspora are making noticeable impact. They are challenging the way we think, daring us to chase our dreams without fear and encouraging us to use our voices. We highlight these women each week in our Women to Watch segment.
How did trafficking survivor Evelyn Chambao from Cameroon end up in the White House? Well, she was 10 years old when her uncle sold her to a Cameroonian woman who would take her to America. Chambao was promised she'd have a better life and a great education abroad. Well, her benefactor turned out to be her trafficker. Forget school, Chambao was forced to cook, clean and care for her captor's children. She was starved, called stupid, fat, ugly and too dirty to sleep on a bed. At 17, Chambal managed to escape with the help of a priest. She graduated from college, and now Chambal works to fight human trafficking. In 2016, then President Barack Obama appointed her to the first ever U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking. Chambal says, if you see something, say something. She could have been rescued a lot sooner, she says. Many people saw her but said nothing. And you know, something else Chambal says is that, you know, there are three things she believes that really present an obstacle to ending human trafficking. She says it's poverty, politics, and governments.
Well, and if you see something, say something is not just a clever catchphrase, it's a strategy that can uncover potential crimes.
And save lives.
Absolutely. Well, another woman who used her voice, South Africa's Mickey Meji from advocacy group Embrace Dignity. Meji is a feminist, an abolitionist, and a human rights activist. But most importantly, she's a survivor. Meji dropped out of school and was lured into prostitution. While on the street, Meji was introduced to Sex Workers Education Advocacy Task Force. She soon realized she wanted to challenge the system of prostitution and abolish it. Meji later became a staunch advocate for abolishing the term sex work and for the industry itself to be recognized as exploitative and oppressive. Meji says she envisions an Africa and a world in which no woman or child is bought, sold, exploited, commodified, or objectified.
Who do you think is a woman to watch? Nominate someone on our social media pages and use the hashtag VOA Our Voices. Be sure to watch Our Voices on voanews.com, where you can find the world's top news stories.
And we leave you with a quote from former U.S. President Barack Obama, who used his voice to say, "It ought to concern every community because it tears at our social fabric. It ought to concern every business because it distorts markets. It ought to concern every nation because it endangers public health and fuels violence and organized crime." I'm talking about the injustice, the outrage of human trafficking, which must be called by its true name, modern slavery.
And that's our final word for this week. Thank you to VOA Zimbabwe Service Digital Lead Journalist Marvelous Nyahuye for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Marvelous.
Thank you for having me
here.
On behalf of the Voice of America and along with my colleagues, thanks for tuning into our voices. I'm Ayan Bior. Good day.